Hey you. Yeah, you. Scrolling through the chaos of the internet, looking for something different. Well, tonight, you just found it. We're diving headfirst into a tale so ancient it predates your favorite myth, yet so oddly juicy it could definitely be the next streaming drama. Kings sweating over bed linens? Entire laws based on a broken membrane? You can't make this stuff up, and lucky for you, you don't have to. This isn't some boring history lecture. It's a front row seat to absurdity, betrayal, and divine-level drama, all told in a way that lulls your brain and wakes your imagination. And trust me, you'll walk away not just entertained, but actually smarter. Weird, right? So here's the deal. If you like late-night brain candy with a dose of truth, smash that like, hit subscribe, and drop your City Plus local time in the comments, so we know who's vibing with us in the time stream tonight. Now dim the lights, cue that background hum, and let's unfold the madness of history together. You begin with a thought so simple it should be calming. The idea that virginity meant something sacred, noble, pure. But hold on, don't get too cozy, because in the Middle Ages, virginity wasn't just about waiting till marriage. It was about power, control, fear, and for the men in the story, pure, church-approved terror. You trudge through cobbled streets where stone chapels cast long shadows, and every clergyman's whisper carries the weight of heaven. Here, virginity wasn't a personal choice. It was a divine calling. To be a virgin woman was to be placed on a pedestal, gazed at like a stained glass saint. But if you were a man, marrying a virgin came with a pressure cooker of expectations. You didn't just marry a person, you married a symbol. The church had a lot to say about it. Virginity was the spiritual gold standard for women. Nuns were brides of Christ. Mary, yes, that Mary, was the eternal poster girl for unblemished womanhood. To remain untouched was to be holy, and to give it. And yet, here's the paradox that kept medieval husbands up at night. If a woman wasn't a virgin, she was damaged goods. But if she was, she came wrapped in purity, mystery, and a heavy dose of superstition. Suddenly, you weren't just marrying a young woman. You were entering into a spiritual contract, one you could easily mess up, one that could curse your name, or worse, your lineage. You walk past stained manuscripts where monks wrote long, meandering treatises about the spiritual dangers of marrying a virgin. They didn't say it outright, of course, too holy for that. But buried in the fine print was a nervous energy. Because how exactly do you consummate a marriage with someone considered holier than you? How do you cross that line without inviting some divine punishment? Now, imagine you're a medieval man. You've done everything right. You prayed, you tithed. You probably haven't bathed this month, but who's counting? And now, you're marrying a young woman who spent her life being told that her purity is her greatest value. What does that do to the wedding night, Romantic candlelight? Try spiritual dread. Some men actually postponed consummation for days, even weeks. Historical accounts suggest they feared defiling something sacred. Saintly wives, they were sometimes called, until they became flesh and blood humans, which was complicated. The fear ran deeper than just awkwardness. Church doctrine painted the loss of virginity as a sort of death. The maidenhead, as they called it, wasn't just tissue. It was a spiritual mark, like a divine seal. Once broken, the woman crossed into a different moral space, less saint, more sinner. And guess who was responsible for that transformation? Yup, you, the husband. Historians still argue whether this view came more from theology or folklore, but either way, it stuck like candle wax on cathedral walls. And it wasn't just abstract fear. Some genuinely believed that intercourse with a virgin could be physically harmful to both parties. Medical texts written by learned men, and we use learned loosely here, warned that the shock to the body could cause illness, imbalance, even death. One medieval doctor insisted that too much pressure during the first act could cause the woman's heart to shift. His solution? Warm baths and prayer, not exactly modern foreplay. Let's pause for a fun little oddity. In some regions, there was a belief that a woman's virginity could grant vitality, almost like drinking a magic potion. So paradoxically, while men feared harming a virgin, they also believed she could recharge them. Talk about mixed signals, and still, the church doubled down. Virginity became political currency. Noble families guarded their daughters' reputations like holy relics. A single rumor could destroy a marriage prospect. And when it came time to arrange unions, families would whisper, investigate, and sometimes bribe local midwives or priests to vouch for a girl's purity. Imagine being inspected for marriage eligibility like a prized horse. Medieval Tinder had a seriously grim vetting process. Here's another twist. While female virginity was idolized, male chastity was treated, let's say, more leniently. The church recommended purity for men, but didn't expect it. A knight could ride into town, dripping with sins, and still marry a pure bride, but if she had even the scent of scandal, cancel the wedding, or worse, burn her as a liar. And if you think women today deal with double standards, imagine this. In many medieval wedding ceremonies, the husband had the right to publicly refuse his wife if he discovered she wasn't a virgin. Some even did so at the altar, publicly, brutally. Meanwhile, his own romantic resume, not a topic of discussion. The layers of pressure were suffocating, for men too, because they weren't just supposed to marry virgins. They were expected to guide them, spiritually and sexually, without crossing the invisible line of sin, a moral tightrope with no safety net. And if the wife didn't bleed on the wedding night, that raised eyebrows, or accusations, or worse. This leads to one of the most bizarre rituals of all, the bridal bed inspection. Yep, in some places, family members, yes, family members, would inspect the bed sheets the morning after the wedding, looking for blood as evidence of honor. No pressure, right? Let's say you were a groom, young, nervous, full of misguided confidence and superstition. The bride's family's waiting. The church expects results, and the entire town might be listening for, proof. There's no world in which that ends well, and many marriages, many lives, spiraled from this singular moment of misaligned expectation and raw fear. So what were men actually afraid of? Not the act itself, perhaps, but what it represented. Loss of control, the unknowable, the power of purity to unravel even the most confident man. A virgin wife wasn't just inexperienced. She was spiritually loaded, symbolically radioactive, and one false step could ruin reputations, stain dynasties, or summon divine wrath. Or so they believed. You lie back now, letting your mind wander through shadowy stone halls, flickering torchlight, and the distant echo of Gregorian chants. You begin to see it. A society obsessed with purity not because it was clean, but because it was dangerous. Untouched meant unstable. Virginity wasn't safe, it was sacred. And sacred things, they break people. That's where you are now. Not in a world of simple romance or ancient ideals, but in a medieval maze where purity was prized, feared, and manipulated, especially by those who claimed to revere it most. And this is just the first twist in the tale. It only gets stranger from here. So there you are, pacing in a damp stone chamber, velvet robes clinging to your legs, sweat beading at your brow, not from heat, but from the sheer weight of expectation. You're the groom, remember? And tonight is the night. The long-awaited first night, where love, legacy, and linen all hang by a thread, or more accurately, by a bloodstain. You glance toward the bed. Crisp white sheets, carefully laid out. Too carefully, because they're not just for comfort, they're evidence. This is the part of the wedding that no one talks about out loud, but everyone anticipates like a festival. The bedding ceremony. And if your stomach just flipped a little, you're not alone. Medieval grooms often dreaded this moment as much as their brides, if not more. You see, it wasn't enough to say, "I do." A marriage in medieval Europe wasn't officially valid unless it was consummated. Not just consumed, mind you, verified, tangibly, physically, publicly. There were rules, protocols, and of course, gossip. If the deed wasn't done and proven, your marriage could be annulled, your honor questioned, and your family legacy thrown into turmoil. The church played backup vocals to this anxiety, insisting that marriage must be both sacrament and sex act. The ritual was sacred, but the consummation, that was mandatory. The idea was that a couple became one flesh, and without the flesh part, the holy part didn't stick. So what did they do? Well, in some regions, especially in noble households, the consummation was witnessed. Yes, witnessed. Picture a bridal bed surrounded by family elders or priestly types, sometimes literally present behind curtains, or at the very least, stationed just outside the door, ears perked, listening for auditory confirmation. You know, the rustle, the cry, the thump, whatever reassured them that God and biology were in alignment. Uncomfortable yet? Welcome to medieval matrimony. And let's not forget the infamous blood-stained sheet. In many traditions, the morning after the wedding, the bride's family proudly displayed the linens as proof of virginity, and thus, honor. A bloodless sheet? That could mean scandal. Accusations of premarital activity, or worse, deception. The bride might be cast aside, punished, even shamed publicly. And here's the tragic bit. Not all women bleed during their first experience. Modern science tells us this is perfectly normal, but back then, the belief was simple: no blood, no virtue. And that terrified everyone. You probably think all this pressure rested squarely on the bride, and yes, it was brutal. But the groom wasn't spared either. In fact, he had one job: to break the seal, to prove his masculinity, and confirm his wife's virtue, all in one clumsy, nerve-wracked act. Failure to perform didn't just bruise egos, it had legal consequences. If a groom couldn't consummate the marriage, the wife could demand an annulment. Courts would get involved. The case might end up in a bishop's lap, where he'd ask very personal questions and potentially order tests. Yes, tests, to assess the husband's functionality. And those tests? Let's just say they were more invasive than your browser history. One recorded method involved subjecting the man to erotic stimuli to prove arousal. Another had him lie next to his wife, naked, but forbidden from touching her. If he still couldn't perform, case closed, marriage annulled. Try explaining that to your sword-fighting buddies. Now zoom out a bit. All of this took place in a society obsessed with symbols. The body was a canvas for spiritual meaning. The virgin's blood wasn't just a mark of sex, it was a covenant. A sign that nature and morality had aligned, that everything, family, faith, flesh, was in balance. But as you know by now, things were never that tidy. Let's wander into a royal court for a moment. Imagine you're a young king, barely out of your teens, marrying a foreign princess. She's never met you, you've never met her. But this alliance, it holds the weight of nations. Entire kingdoms are watching. And once the feast ends and the guests retreat, it's not over. You're both marched to your chamber while a crowd waits to make sure the union is sealed. Some courts even staged elaborate bedding ceremonies, where attendants undressed the bride and groom, like actors preparing for a final scene. Candles flickered, jokes were told, and the unspoken command lingered in the air: do it right, or else. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were symbolic or actually enforced with expectation. But whether literal or figurative, the pressure was real. More than a few kings failed to perform, and their kingdoms paid the price. Let's pause here for a quirk of culture. In some medieval towns, if the marriage wasn't consummated by dawn, the bride could sue. And in one particularly strange record from France, a groom was forced to prove his potency in public, on the steps of the town hall, with witnesses. No pressure, right? And speaking of blood and proof, let's talk about the relic trade. Yes, the medieval church had a fascination with holy relics, bits of saints' bones, vials of sacred oil, even pieces of the true cross. But among the oddest were the so-called virgin relics, cloths allegedly stained by the Virgin Mary's own birth or by other saintly women's first nights. Were these real? Almost certainly not. But they were bought, sold, and venerated, because people believed in the power of purity and its physical evidence, which leads us to a strange paradox. Blood was unclean in most religious contexts. Menstruation, taboo, childbirth, contaminated, but virginal blood, that was sacred. A contradiction that bled into, pun intended, everything from theology to medicine. Let's not forget the poets. Troubadours sang of maiden bloom and first blush. They romanticized the mystery of virginity, turning the first night into a mythic transformation. But those same poems hinted at fear, of failure, of defilement, of divine consequences. One 12th century lyric even described the groom as a knight on sacred ground, trembling at the gate. Subtle, not exactly. And let's be real. Underneath all this sacred drama was a very human layer of fear, inexperience, anxiety, the dread of intimacy after a life of pious warnings. The first night wasn't about love. It was about surviving expectations for both parties. By now your eyes are probably heavy, but your thoughts might still linger on the surreal rituals of that world. The bloodied sheets, the hushed whispers, the thin veil between holiness and humiliation. For medieval men, marrying a virgin was supposed to be the ultimate prize, but often it felt more like a test they weren't ready to take. And failing that test, it could undo everything. You drift now, the chamber walls fading into soft mist, the echoes of celebration replaced by quiet murmurs. Somewhere, a groom hesitates. A bride shivers under too much fabric. Outside the chamber, a crowd waits, not for love, but for proof. This is the world you've stepped into, a world where history sleeps in silk sheets and wakes up in judgment, and you're only just getting comfortable. You rub your temples and try to make sense of it. How a simple thing like virginity, something now spoken of with hushed embarrassment or cheeky irony, once governed the entire operating system of human relationships, and not just emotionally, but biologically, medically, cosmically even, because in the Middle Ages, the science of the body was more art than anatomy, and that art was painted in fear, folklore, and faulty logic. You're in the presence of learned men now, scholars with ink-stained fingers and furrowed brows, hunched over thick tomes filled with theories about the female body. The year is somewhere around 1280, and they've just declared that a woman's womb can wander through her body like a lost sheep. They call it hysteria, from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb, and they mean it quite literally. Yes, these doctors genuinely believed that if a virgin remained untouched too long, her womb might grow restless, slide upward through her torso, and press against her heart or brain. This, they said, would cause fainting, madness, or even death. The cure? You guessed it. Marriage. More specifically, sex. But only the sanctioned, moral, church-approved variety, of course. This wandering womb theory wasn't just a medical curiosity, it was a social justification. It made virginity dangerous. It gave husbands another reason to fear the bridal chamber. If they waited too long, her womb might move. And that wasn't even the weirdest theory floating around. One prominent medieval physician warned that first-time intercourse could cause a woman's blood to boil, unless balanced by the man's cooling seed. Others argued that an unbroken hymen created pressure inside the body, like a sealed vessel, and that the release was essential to mental balance. Yes, the human body, in their minds, was basically a medieval crockpot. You trail behind one of these physicians through the damp stone corridors of a medieval university. He's explaining to students, mostly boys barely old enough to shave, that virginity is a condition of imbalance. Too much cold, too much moisture, not enough circulation of the humors. These humors, by the way, are four bodily fluids believed to govern everything from personality to fate: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. What does that mean for you? A virgin wife might be melancholic or prone to mood swings, possibly even visions. And what happens if a groom stumbles into marriage without reading the medieval version of WebMD? Pure panic. Imagine him on the wedding night, noticing that his wife is pale, anxious, trembling. Rather than recognizing fear or nerves, he might believe she's in a pre-hysterical state, about to be overwhelmed by her womb or struck by divine punishment. Some men genuinely feared that sex would unleash not passion, but disease. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were held by common folk or just the medical elite. But fragments of these ideas show up everywhere, from court records to personal letters, even in folk songs. One tune describes a man who hesitated to touch his bride because he feared the wrath of the moon in her belly. Translation: he thought she might die from the act itself. And when something did go wrong, say, if a bride fainted or cried or froze up entirely, the first instinct wasn't to call a midwife. It was often to summon a priest, because what else could cause such behavior but demons? Here's where things get really strange. There was a belief that demons, particularly incubuses, could inhabit a virgin's body, not in a Hollywood exorcist kind of way, but subtly. They might block consummation, or induce sickness, or cause the bride to become suddenly unwilling. So if your wedding night went awry, it wasn't just awkward, it was potentially diabolical. In one documented case, a nobleman called for an exorcism when his new wife fell into spasms after the ceremony. She wasn't possessed, of course, she was terrified. But her fear was misread through the lens of spiritual warfare. The church intervened. Candles were lit, Latin was chanted. No one asked how she felt. Let's slide in a curious little tidbit. Some midwives carried protective charms specifically for bridal nights. Tiny amulets, tucked into pillows or sewn into robes, meant to ward off bad spirits or wandering wombs. These weren't always sanctioned by the church, but they weren't fully condemned either. When fear controls the room, people will accept help from anywhere. Meanwhile, men were told to prepare themselves spiritually, to approach the first night with reverence and caution, lest they awaken powers they couldn't control. A virgin wife wasn't a partner, she was a portal, and the act of consummation was less an embrace, more a rite. Like opening a sealed temple, you didn't barge in, you prayed first, and if the wife expressed pain or resistance, it wasn't interpreted as trauma or discomfort. No, it was her soul resisting corruption, or her body clinging to purity, which meant that hesitation was expected, even desired. Men were told to press forward gently, with a mixture of devotion and dominance, and women, they were told to endure. You step into a chapel now, where a priest is preaching about the Virgin Mary. But between the lines of his sermon is a message about your wife, that she too is called to sacred purity, that her virtue is fragile, and you must protect it, even as you end it. Confused? You should be. Because the messages were contradictory by design. Women were told their virginity was their worth. Men were told to break that worth, but only with sacred intent. One wrong move, and you've dishonored not just your wife, but the entire lineage and possibly the heavens. Let's pause for another head tilter. In some medical texts, it was said that virgin blood held alchemical properties, that it could be used in potions for healing or cursing. Yes, there were folk healers who claimed that blood from a virgin's first night could be used to craft love spells, fertility elixirs, or even poisons. Whether anyone actually used it that way is unclear, but the belief itself made the idea of virginity even more charged, even more dangerous. So now you've got husbands worrying about whether their wives will bleed, faint, die, or curse them, all before the wedding cake's even stale. And still, the Church kept doubling down. Virgin martyrs were canonized. Saint Agnes, Saint Cecilia, Saint Lucy, all praised for dying before they ever touched a man. Their purity was a weapon, and their deaths were seen as victories over lust and corruption. You wonder, what message does that send to a man about marrying a live, flesh and blood woman? By now, your mind is drifting into the folds of twilight logic. You feel the weight of woolen robes, hear the creak of bedposts and whispered prayers, sense the silent terror of a man who wants to be good, holy, strong, but doesn't know if he's about to destroy a saint or disappoint a crowd, and all because he married a virgin. This is the tightrope that medieval husbands walked. Not just fear of failure, but fear of power. Because purity, it turns out, wasn't passive. It didn't just exist, it was volatile, mysterious, able to shift the balance of health, luck, even salvation. If you didn't handle it right, you risked not just shame, but supernatural fallout. So what did men do? Some drank to numb the nerves. Some hired midwives to prepare the bride with herbal remedies or secret tricks. Some sought out priests for a blessing. A few even tried to avoid consummation altogether, claiming spiritual vows or illness as excuses. The irony? Many were more afraid of touching a virgin than fighting in a crusade. And as you slowly exhale, the echoes of ancient medicine, misplaced holiness, and fragile egos drift through your thoughts like incense in a cold cathedral. You realize something. In this world, purity wasn't just about morality. It was a threat, a force, a kind of medieval magic men barely understood, but feared enough to obey. And we're still only scratching the surface. You stretch out, pulling your blanket closer, and drift further into the weird, shadowy theater of medieval minds, where the line between superstition and religion was blurrier than a wine-soaked manuscript. Now picture this. You've just married a young woman who everyone swears is pure, virtuous, and untouched. But the wedding night doesn't go according to plan. She freezes up. She faints. She shakes or speaks in tongues. You don't think stage fright. You think demonic possession. Because believe it or not, that's exactly what some medieval men believed was happening. You tiptoe through the candlelit corridors of a noble manor, where a bride has locked herself in a chamber and refuses to be touched. The groom, pale and trembling, isn't reaching for wine or a sympathetic uncle. He's summoning a priest. Because clearly, his virgin wife is under attack from unholy forces. This wasn't a rare belief. In fact, it was woven into the very cultural fabric of medieval life. For women, virginity was sacred. But anything sacred was also vulnerable to corruption. And if you were touched by a demon, or worse, housing one, you could expect a life of isolation, suspicion, and spiritual healing that looked a lot more like punishment. The church had a protocol for this, of course. The Ritual Romanum, the official manual of exorcism, laid out specific prayers and actions for expelling demons from the human body. It's not all spinning heads and pie soup, but it is full of intense ritual, fasting, holy water, and the laying on of hands. Sometimes entire communities were summoned to pray over a bride, too reluctant to perform her matrimonial duties. And here's the kicker. These episodes weren't always faked. Some young brides genuinely experienced mental breakdowns after being handed off, sometimes at 13 or 14, to a much older man and expected to fulfill wifely duties immediately. Trauma and fear were interpreted through the religious lens of the time, and what looked like a panic attack to us would have looked like demonic interference to them. Historians still argue whether these possession cases were convenient excuses for failed consummation or legitimate episodes of mental distress. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. But one thing's certain, the fear was real, and not just for brides. Men were terrified of marrying a woman who might unravel, who might carry not just innocence, but unknowable chaos. There were whispered tales of virgins whose untouched state attracted spirits, good and bad. Some monks believe virgins were spiritually open, like blank pages demons could write upon. Charming bedtime thought, huh? Let's wander through one of those tales now. In a 14th century Italian town, a man annulled his marriage because his wife began screaming at shadows on their wedding night. She claimed to see a black-winged creature perching in the rafters. He called in a local priest, who declared the home cursed. The sheets were burned. The marriage was dissolved. The girl was sent to a convent. She never married again, and this wasn't some fringe village nonsense. Royal courts dealt with similar claims. One chronicler describes a French prince who refused to touch his wife after she began chanting in Latin every time they were alone. Was she possessed? Had she memorized church hymns too well? Or was she just trying to delay the inevitable? No one knows, but the exorcist was called nonetheless. Some exorcists specialized in bridal spirits, entities said to haunt virgins just before consummation. These spirits weren't always malevolent. Sometimes they were believed to be jealous, the ghosts of unwed lovers or suitors who died before claiming their bride. And so, in yet another twist of bizarre logic, the fear wasn't just about the living, it was about the dead too. Let's not skip over a charming medieval notion that virgins had power, not just social power, but actual spiritual energy. And while this power could sanctify, it could also disrupt. There are stories of virgins who healed the sick simply by walking past them, or caused crops to fail just by refusing marriage. One local legend from Saxony told of a girl whose virginity caused all the village's milk to curdle until she agreed to marry. Talk about peer pressure. This mystical interpretation of virginity made things tricky for grooms. On one hand, you were told to cherish your wife's purity. On the other, you were warned that it made her unpredictable, wild, even magical. In a world without science, magic was often just a placeholder for fear. And purity, paradoxically, was treated with the same caution as poison. You wander now into a monastery where an old monk scribbles away in the margins of a religious manuscript. He's jotting down notes about bridal purity and holy resistance. His handwriting grows shaky when he writes about wives who remain untouched for too long, how they are at risk of attracting the dark whisperer. Who that is, we're not told, but it sounds like the kind of figure you wouldn't want showing up between your wedding vows and breakfast. Let's take a detour for one of those historical oddities that historians love. In 1321, an English bishop reported to the Vatican that a newly married woman in his diocese had refused her conjugal duties for 3 nights, during which she spoke in unknown tongues and struck her husband with a wooden spoon. The spoon is what gets us. She later claimed she was overtaken by Saint Margaret, who warned her not to surrender her virginity until her husband proved his piety. Did she actually believe that? Or did she just not like the guy? We'll never know. But the record exists. And what did the church do? Often they supported the husband, which meant the bride might be subjected to prayers, fasting, even isolation, until she returned to herself. But if she didn't, she might be quietly removed, sent to a convent, or declared mentally unfit. The idea that virginity made women more spiritually susceptible wasn't just a male fear. It became a legal and religious justification for control. For her own good, they'd say, as if holiness were a kind of sickness, but not everyone bought into it. Some clergy, especially in urban centers, began pushing back. They suggested that many so-called possessions were really emotional trauma or resistance. That maybe, just maybe, a terrified 14-year-old girl shouldn't be expected to embrace her wedding night like a saint descending from the clouds. Still, change was slow, and in remote villages, the same old stories played out. Trembling brides, panicked grooms, and priests murmuring incantations while women wept into pillows embroidered with lilies. Let's slow down for a moment. Picture a wedding chamber. The fire's burning low, the guests have left, and a young man stands at the foot of the bed, unsure if he's about to share a night of intimacy or start a battle with an invisible force. He was told this was supposed to be holy, natural, expected, but nothing about it feels that way. The air is thick with incense and dread. This is the psychological landscape of medieval marriage. It wasn't just awkward, it was sacredly terrifying. And here's a final twist to lull you deeper into this medieval maze. Some believed that if you failed to consummate your marriage because your bride was possessed, it wasn't your fault. But if you succeeded, even if she resisted, it was proof you were spiritually strong. So in this strange logic, consent became irrelevant. Power was morality, and purity was a burden carried by both, but often dropped by her alone. You close your eyes now and float backward, past the cold walls, past the rituals, past the flickering fears of long-dead brides and their bewildered husbands. And you realize, fear didn't just haunt castles and churches, it lived in beds. It whispered through veils. It sat between newlyweds, wrapped in purity, and waited. Because marrying a virgin wasn't just a rite of passage, it was a walk through a minefield, where one wrong step could bring not just shame, but demons. You ease further into the haze, where ancient kings tiptoe through their own history, cloaked not in glory, but in marital dread. Because tonight, we're climbing even higher up the social ladder, and the stakes are more than just embarrassing. They're existential. You're not just marrying a woman, you're sealing an alliance, betting your crown and gambling the bloodline of an entire realm on whether a young bride bleeds on a linen sheet. Welcome to royal marriage in the Middle Ages, where the pressure of proving virginity wasn't just personal, it was geopolitical. Let's place you at court now. You're a young prince, recently betrothed to a foreign princess, one you've never seen without an entourage of veils and advisors. The deal has taken years of negotiation, countless envoys, gifts, and oaths, sworn on sacred relics. The political tides depend on this moment. Alliances with rival kingdoms, trade routes, dowries worth a dozen castles. And still, it all comes down to one question. Was she a virgin? Because if she wasn't, you could refuse her. You could send her home, cause an international scandal, ignite a feud, maybe even start a war. And don't think it hasn't happened. There are documented cases, real, tragic, wildly uncomfortable, of kings and princes rejecting their wives based on suspicions of prior impurity. One of the most infamous? Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. After years of marriage and 2 daughters, Louis still couldn't shake the idea that Eleanor wasn't pure enough to be his queen. Their marriage was annulled, officially due to consanguinity, too closely related, but everyone whispered the real reason. She wasn't chaste enough. Eleanor, by the way, would go on to marry Henry II of England and give birth to Richard the Lionheart. So take that, Louis. Back in the chamber, though, there's no such future vision. There's only now. The torches have been lowered. The advisors hover too close to the door. Somewhere in the corner, a servant folds the ceremonial nightshirt you're supposed to wear to bed. You feel the weight of your family's name pressing on your spine. The kingdom must be continued. The marriage must be real. And real meant consummated. But here's the truly horrifying twist. It wasn't enough to privately confirm the deed. In royal marriages, consummation often required a public statement. Some courts demanded testimony from servants, midwives, or even bishops. In Spain and France, royal bedding ceremonies involved actual witnesses. People invited to the couple's chamber, sometimes to physically guide them to bed, and then return to the hall and announce, to thunderous applause, that the marriage had been sealed. Imagine the wedding DJ announcing, "And now, the royal deflowering has been confirmed. Let's hit the dance floor." Yeah, that. Historians still argue whether all these ceremonies were ceremonial or literal. Some say the witnesses left before the act. Others claim they listened from nearby rooms. Either way, the couple's intimacy wasn't their own. It was an act of state, a performance in flesh and blood, and that blood, still non-negotiable. A queen's honor, her suitability, even her children's legitimacy, all hinged on whether she bled that first night. If she didn't, the implications were nuclear. You tiptoe into one particularly cold tale. Margaret of Scotland, who married Eric II of Norway in the late 1200s. Rumors circulated that she had been previously compromised. Eric's court demanded proof. When it wasn't produced to their satisfaction, whispers of annulment loomed, until a politically savvy priest crafted a delicate lie, affirming her hidden virtue without blood. Margaret's future and the peace between nations had hung by a thread or a stain. And it wasn't always about suspicions. Sometimes it was about ambition. Rivals of a new queen might accuse her of impurity to undermine her power. One accusation could derail a crown. A single chambermaid's testimony could end a dynasty. The political terrain of virginity was landmined. Let's look at a fringe tidbit, because what's royal drama without some surreal extras? In the court of Henry VIII, rumors swirled that special cushions were placed on the wedding bed to better absorb and display evidence of consummation. Some even claimed the sheets were pre-treated with a mix of herbs that would react with blood to darken more dramatically under torchlight. Essentially, ancient blacklight technology for the sake of honor. And speaking of Henry VIII, let's not forget the mess with Catherine of Aragon. Henry claimed that because Catherine had previously been married to his brother, though that marriage was reportedly never consummated, their union was invalid. The church, politics, and some very sticky sheets all played a role in what would eventually lead to the English Reformation. But even in less dramatic examples, you see the pattern. The fear wasn't just about a woman's past, it was about a man's future. A king had to ensure that any child born of his queen was his, and the only way to do that, short of paternity tests, which wouldn't exist for another 800 years, was to start with a certified untouched bride. And this obsession with untouchedness created absurd, often cruel traditions. In some royal courts, young princesses were kept in seclusion from the age of 12 onward, watched over by governesses, maids, and religious tutors. Every interaction was monitored, every word written down, because any hint of impropriety could unravel everything. In one particularly brutal example, a young noblewoman was sent to a convent not for misbehaving, but for laughing too loudly at a courtier's joke. Her father feared it might signal flirtation. She remained cloistered for 3 years before being returned to the marriage market, untouched, but permanently traumatized. And what about the men? Were they held to the same standard? Not even close. Kings were expected to have mistresses, affairs, illegitimate children, all part of the royal package. But if a queen so much as looked too long at a stable boy, her head could roll. So yes, the double standard was real and bloody. Still, the absurdity didn't stop the rituals. Kings continued to demand proof. Queens continued to suffer under scrutiny, and marriages continued to be judged not by love or kindness, but by what appeared on a bedspread the morning after. But let's slow the pace now. Imagine that you're that royal groom, back in your chamber. The candlelight flickers. Your bride sits at the edge of the bed, small and still. She's not your enemy. She's not even your partner yet. She's a stranger holding your future in her body. You don't know what she's thinking. Maybe she's terrified too. Maybe she's praying. Maybe she's hoping you'll be gentle, or that this whole thing will somehow just skip ahead to the part where you're older and wiser and less scrutinized. But for now, all you have is silence, ritual, and expectation. And that's the most haunting thing of all. Because behind all the political drama, all the courtly fanfare, is 2 human beings, trapped in a moment neither of them asked for. A moment steeped in pressure and fear, not passion. A moment where what happens or doesn't might decide the fate of nations. And yet, the world watched. So you pull the covers closer now, feeling the cold seep in from those echoing palace walls. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls the hour. Another royal wedding. Another set of expectations. another bed that will be examined like a battlefield. And you, hovering quietly over the centuries, understand the bitter truth. In this world, even love had to submit to the politics of purity. You exhale slowly, sinking deeper into the candle-lit absurdity of medieval life, where even the courtroom smelled faintly of incense, anxiety, and bad theology. Because tonight, we're stepping into the halls of medieval justice, not to right wrongs, but to judge virginity. Yes, you're entering a world where maidenhood could be examined, debated, and prosecuted. Welcome to the very real, very surreal phenomenon of the courtroom virginity trial. Let's set the scene. You're a young nobleman who married a well-dowered bride 2 weeks ago. So far, no blood, no luck, no heir. And now, rumors are flying. Your mother is fuming. Your father-in-law is asking pointed questions. You've tried wine, prayer, and even a midwife's whispered suggestions involving lavender oil and warm compresses. Nothing's worked. So you do what any self-respecting medieval man would. You sue your wife. Yes, this was a thing. In marriage disputes, the question of virginity often became a legal matter. And these trials? They were just as dramatic and mortifying as you might imagine. The court would hear arguments from both sides. The husband might claim his bride deceived him, citing her lack of bleeding or unnatural resistance as evidence. The bride might counter by blaming his inability, or more delicately, his lack of divine favor. But the real clincher, the physical examination. Yes, this part gets uncomfortable. If the court deemed it necessary, they could order a virginity test. A panel of matrons, typically older, married women of good standing, would be appointed to examine the bride's body. No doctors, no science, just gossip, superstition, and years of bathhouse small talk masquerading as expertise. You can't make this up. A group of strangers would inspect the bride for physical signs of intactness, often mistaking perfectly normal anatomy for proof of guilt or innocence. The hymen, the mythical gatekeeper of virtue, was treated as courtroom evidence, even though medical knowledge of it was wildly inaccurate and inconsistent. Historians still argue whether these tests were more about formality than truth, but there are plenty of recorded cases where the outcomes ruined lives. If the matrons declared her a fraud, the marriage could be annulled, the bride shamed, and the family dishonored. And if the husband was lying or simply, let's say, underperforming, too bad. His testimony still carried more weight. One famous case from 14th century France involved a knight who claimed his noble bride had deceived him. When she was examined and declared a virgin, he insisted she was using sorcery to heal herself after each encounter. Yes, magic hymen regeneration. Instead of dismissing the case, the court seriously considered the claim. Eventually, the knight was fined for defamation, but not before dragging his wife's name through every tavern and temple from Paris to Avignon. You walk now through a dimly lit ecclesiastical court, where robed judges hear a case from a furious young groom. He insists his wife tricked him. He demands justice. The clerics murmur. A notary scribbles on parchment. Outside, peasants gather to whisper about the scandal. It's a spectacle, a humiliation, and a warning. Because these trials weren't just about one marriage. They were public morality plays, a chance for the community to reinforce the rules, shame the rule breakers, and bask in a delicious mix of outrage and entertainment. Let's drift into a more rural courtroom now, where things get even stranger. In some towns, if a woman was accused of losing her virginity before marriage, she could be subjected to a trial by ordeal. Yes, ordeal, the medieval version of a lie detector test, only more painful. One method involved carrying a red-hot iron bar a certain distance. If the woman's hands healed cleanly after a few days, she was deemed innocent, miraculously protected by divine justice. If they blistered and festered, as you'd expect when carrying hot iron, well, guilty. Another ordeal, dunking. Accused women were tied and lowered into rivers. Floating meant guilt, sinking meant innocence. Drowning was a bummer, but at least your soul was cleared. And for what crime? Being sexually active before marriage, or worse, being suspected of it. In these villages, a woman's body didn't belong to her. It was evidence. Her virtue was her value, and if questioned, she had to prove it. Here's a bizarre fringe tidbit. In some communities, it was believed that a true virgin's urine could repel snakes, or cause certain herbs to wilt. So yes, you might be asked to pee on a plant to prove your chastity. This wasn't science. This was folklore on steroids. But to the medieval mind, it made perfect sense. Now step into the minds of the women. Imagine the pressure, the humiliation, the quiet rage. Many of them had done nothing wrong, just married young, or bled late, or not at all. Others had been assaulted but dared not say so, because silence preserved more dignity than truth. In all cases, the system was rigged. If a man accused his wife, his voice thundered. If a woman accused her husband of cruelty or impotence, she whispered. And even if she dared to speak, she often wasn't believed. Virginity was considered objective. Manhood? Subjective. That tells you everything you need to know. Still, some women fought back. One German woman, accused of lying about her purity, demanded her husband be examined instead. The court allowed it, and the results were devastating for him. The matrons found no signs of misconduct on her, and his performance was underwhelming. She was granted a rare public apology and a generous settlement, but don't get too hopeful. It was an exception, not the rule. The church, for its part, danced a strange little jig between doctrine and superstition. On paper, it preached forgiveness, chastity, spiritual purity, but in practice, it enabled scrutiny, encouraged silence, and upheld public shaming when it suited the social order. After all, what better way to keep control than to turn every bedroom into a battleground for moral law? Let's drift into one last courtroom tale before we let your mind loosen again. In Venice, in the early 1400s, a young woman was taken to court by her husband after failing to produce the expected wedding night blood. The trial dragged for months. Her reputation frayed. Doctors debated, matrons examined. A priest was even called to assess her soul. In the end, she was declared a natural virgin who simply hadn't bled. But the damage was done. She retired to a convent, not because she wanted to, but because the world outside refused to forget. Now you rest your head and trace the outline of this strange, cold justice system. A courtroom where innocence bled, literally. Where the truth didn't matter, only perception. Where women stood trial not for crimes, but for biology. And slowly, gently, you understand. The fear medieval men had of virgin wives wasn't just about sex. It was about control, about proof, about the terror of what couldn't be seen, measured, or guaranteed. Virginity was invisible, unreliable, and yet demanded. So they tried to make it visible through tests, trials, and torment. But in doing so, they only revealed their own uncertainty. You drift a little deeper now, slipping from the dim courts and creaking monasteries into a darker, more shadowy marketplace, one with whispered deals, locked cabinets, and quiet knocks at back doors. Because where there is demand, there is supply. And in the Middle Ages, the demand for proof of virginity was so high, so relentless, that an entire secret economy rose up to meet it. Tonight, you step behind the veil into the fake virgin industry. Yes, you heard that right. When expectations became unbearable, some women and their families turned to desperate measures. After all, if your entire future hinged on whether a bedsheet looked a certain way in the morning, wouldn't you hedge your bets? Let's walk into a back room in 14th century Florence. A young woman, her wedding set for next week, sits with her mother and an elderly herbalist. The room smells of myrrh and boiled roots. On the table, a small packet containing goat's blood, tightly wrapped in pig bladder. This, the herbalist explains, is to be inserted just before the wedding night. With heat and movement, the bladder will burst, simulating proof. The cost? half a year's wages. The result? Honor preserved, at least on the surface. And this wasn't rare. Versions of this tactic pop up in records across Europe, from Paris to Krakow. Midwives and healers, some respected, others operating in secrecy, offered what they called remedies for honor. A little blood, a little staging, and voila, virginity restored. One physician from 15th century Spain warned of deceptions of the body, writing angrily that women simulate the flower of their youth, using blood, false cries, and herbs that mimic the trembling of inexperience. His tone drips with fear and outrage, because to him, a woman faking virginity wasn't just dishonest. It was a direct threat to patriarchal control. Let's pause for one of those eerie fringe facts. There was a specific plant, alum, often used in tightening tonics, to replicate the sensation of virginity. Herbalists would grind it with rose oil and instruct brides to apply it internally. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it burned. Always it was done in secret. And what about hymen reconstruction? You'd think that's a modern surgery, but even then, people tried. Historical records show attempts to sew or pinch the tissue to simulate the premarital state. Crude, painful, and unreliable, but it shows how far people would go when their futures depended on it. You wander now through the narrow alleys of Cairo, where similar rituals flourished. In Islamic cultures at the time, the hymen was also held as proof of honor, and secretive restorations became part of the underground economy. Midwives carried out procedures in the dead of night. Traders even sold packets of animal blood at market stalls, wrapped like spices, because shame, it seems, is a global export, and the market didn't stop at props and procedures. There were coaches, yes, coaches, who taught young brides how to cry, how to tremble, how to feign pain and inexperience so convincingly that even seasoned men believed it. One Arabic love manual from the 13th century actually outlines tips for performing virginity. Among them, hold your breath, close your eyes at the moment of contact, and scream once, not twice. Apparently, 2 screams was too suspicious. Historians still debate how widespread these tricks were. Some believe they were the desperate actions of a few. Others say they were common, even expected, among elite households where honor was everything and surveillance was constant. Either way, the existence of such a market proves one thing. The fear of discovery was real, and it shaped behavior, right down to the private choreography of a wedding night. Let's not forget the grooms in this scenario. Some of them knew. Maybe not explicitly, but they suspected. And still they went along with it. Because rejecting a bride wasn't just a statement about her. It was a political risk, a social scandal, a challenge to the families involved. So better to nod, accept the proof, and move on. One nobleman in southern France wrote in a private letter that his bride performed admirably, and the blood was seen, though the act felt practiced. A diplomatic way of saying, she fooled me, and I let her. In fact, some families were in on it. Mothers prepared the fake blood. Aunts gave coaching sessions. Older sisters passed down secret recipes for herbal sedatives and how to apply blush to mimic nervousness. It was a twisted form of inheritance, wisdom for survival in a world obsessed with control. And yet, for all this effort, the punishment for discovery was severe. If a woman was caught faking virginity, the consequences could be life-ruining. Some were cast out of their homes. Others were accused of witchcraft, because who else but a witch could deceive so completely? A few even faced public trials, branding, or forced entry into convents. You might have faked your way into marriage, but if your husband changed his mind, he could use your deception to destroy you. Here's a truly disturbing little anecdote. In a village near Vienna, a bride was found out when the goat's blood packet she used burst too early, staining her gown during the wedding ceremony itself. The groom stormed out. The bride was dragged from the altar and imprisoned in a local nunnery for life, according to records. Was she guilty of deception, or just unlucky? History doesn't care. The stain did the talking. And while we're here, let's address the even darker corners. Some women didn't fake anything themselves. Their families did it for them, sometimes without their knowledge. A mother might stage the bed. A servant might splash the sheet. By morning, the bride wakes to applause and confusion, and then she has to live up to the lie. Can you imagine? Your entire marriage built on a false stain. Your husband watching your every move, wondering when your act will slip. That kind of pressure doesn't fade, it curdles. Still, in some places, these tricks became so common that they were whispered about openly. Midwives had reputations. Certain herbs were called bride's blessing. In Florence, a shop selling red-dyed linen became so notorious that the church shut it down, but 3 months later it reopened, under a new name. Because shame doesn't stop commerce, it just makes it quieter. You close your eyes now and picture the layers of fabric, the careful choreography, the whispers behind veils. You think of all the women who faked innocence to survive marriage, and all the men who pretended not to notice, to survive marriage too, and you realize it wasn't just virginity that was faked. It was the entire performance of purity, a stage set by fear, lit by tradition, and watched by a society that cared more about symbolism than reality. And still the curtain had to rise. You stretch your legs beneath the covers, the soft rustle of blankets echoing faintly against the clink of imagined chainmail. Because we're entering one of the most infamous zones of medieval anxiety, where love, honor, and physical restraint took a disturbingly literal form. Tonight, you find yourself beside a knight. He's preparing to ride off to battle, cloak billowing, sword gleaming, horse pawing at the earth. But before he gallops into glory, he has to deal with one last terrifying unknown, his wife. More specifically, what she might do while he's gone. So, with equal parts fear and misguided romance, he locks her up. No, not in a tower, in iron underwear. Welcome to the mythology and partial reality of chastity belts. You've probably seen them in cartoons or Renaissance fair jokes. Medieval contraptions designed to prevent a woman from having sex in her husband's absence. But were they real? The short answer is, kind of. The long answer is more complicated, more disturbing, and much more telling about how deeply men feared the unpredictability of virgin and non-virgin wives alike. Let's unpack this slowly. The first real references to chastity belts don't appear in earnest until the 15th century, long after the High Middle Ages. And even then, many of the images we have come from satirical woodcuts and joke manuals. Think of them like medieval memes. But the very fact that these belts were imagined, joked about, and sometimes even crafted speaks volumes. You walk now through the musty corridors of a museum in Germany. There, behind glass, sits a rusted metal contraption shaped vaguely like women's undergarments, except with a horrifying twist, a lock and key. There are holes for elimination, but not much else. The sign reads, Chastity Belt, 16th century, possibly ceremonial. Historians still argue whether these items were ever widely used, or whether they were novelty items, punishment tools, or even misunderstood medical devices. But here's the key point. The idea of the chastity belt was taken seriously, and for many men, it was an imagined solution to a very real fear, that their wives' bodies would betray them. The logic, twisted as it was, went something like this. Virginity is sacred. Women are temptable. Men are gone for war, pilgrimage, or business. Therefore, lock it up. Let's take a detour to one of the more disturbing corners of folklore. Some belts were said to be spiked. Yes, you heard that right. Designed not just to block access, but to punish it. Intruders would find themselves sliced, stabbed, or worse. And while no confirmed examples of these nightmarish contraptions exist, the stories spread like wildfire. Because men didn't just want assurance, they wanted retribution. The belt became both seal and trap, and this wasn't limited to satire. In some Italian texts, it was considered a moral invention. One 15th century pamphlet praised a blacksmith for crafting such a device for jealous husbands. The man was called a protector of sacred honor, which is a very fancy way of saying insecure. Now let's widen the lens. Even if physical chastity belts weren't used en masse, their psychological counterpart absolutely was. Men controlled their wives' movements, clothing, friendships, and even their prayers. A woman with too much freedom was a danger. A wife who laughed too loudly, suspicious. One who read too much, dangerous. One who left the house without male escort, scandalous. In this way, the mental chastity belt was very real. Restriction, control, and suspicion wrapped around the female body like invisible chains. Virginity might have ended with the wedding night, but the anxiety didn't. Men feared their wives would change, that they might awaken to pleasure, to power, to independence. And that fear drove them to metaphorical and sometimes literal extremes. Here's a strange little fringe tidbit. In some towns, newlywed women were encouraged to sleep with knives beneath their pillows, not for defense, but to cut away dreams of temptation. Superstition held that the blade warded off lustful spirits, and for husbands it was a small psychological comfort, her own mind helping police her purity. And we can't forget the Crusades. Oh, the Crusades. Thousands of knights leaving Europe for the Holy Land, praying for victory and worrying about infidelity. While the Church encouraged faith and loyalty, many husbands returned years later to children who looked suspiciously unrelated. This led to legal battles, annulments, inheritance scandals, and in some places, the whispered suggestion that a real knight would have used a belt. There's even a documented case from 1420s Germany of a blacksmith who specialized in marital locks. He was both feared and respected. He claimed to install belts not only on brides, but on unmarried daughters of exceptional beauty. And while no physical examples from his workshop have survived, the records of his fees and clientele remain. Whether myth or marketing, the idea spread. You walk now through a town square, where a young bride clutches a wedding bouquet with one hand and tugs at her stiff bodice with the other. Her new husband smiles, but his eyes are scanning the crowd, already on guard. He will monitor her letters. He will question her servants. He will remember that she once danced too freely at a harvest festival and file it away as a red flag. Because in a world obsessed with purity, even joy became suspicious. And it's not just knights and kings. Even common husbands feared infidelity, not just for emotional reasons, but legal ones. A child born out of wedlock, if claimed as legitimate, could disrupt inheritances. Property, titles, even simple land plots passed through bloodlines. And if a wife's womb had been accessed by another man, that entire system collapsed. So once again, the female body became less a person and more a vault. One that had to be sealed, guarded, and, when necessary, punished. And while the image of the chastity belt often sparks laughter today, to the medieval man it was deadly serious. Whether used literally or not, it represented his final line of defense against the thing he feared most, uncertainty. Let's look at a strange contradiction, just to keep things perfectly medieval. Some men demanded their wives be chaste, but also expected them to be flirtatious in public, to show off their beauty, to enhance their social standing. A pretty wife was a status symbol. A too attractive one, a liability. You couldn't win. Women were taught to balance on the narrowest beam of respectability, beautiful but not vain, obedient but not silent, pure but not prudish, sensual but only when summoned. And many walked this beam their entire lives, teetering between suspicion and shame. So where did the belts go? By the Renaissance, most references to chastity belts had moved fully into satire. Plays and poems joked about them. Artists painted them as symbols of male folly. And yet, the anxiety remained. The belt may have vanished, but the fear of a wife's agency, her body, her choices, stuck around like a ghost in the chamber. You're starting to sense a pattern here. Every medieval institution, marriage, church, medicine, law, treated women's sexuality like a volatile element. Virginity wasn't just a state of being, it was a weapon, a contract, a ticking time bomb. And once it was gone, men scrambled to control what came next. You let your thoughts melt now, the iron glint of metaphorical belts fading into smoke. Somewhere, a blacksmith cools his hammer, a knight rides toward a holy war, and back home, a young bride stares out a narrow window, wondering when her own war will begin. Because in this strange old world, the chastity belt wasn't just a device. It was an entire worldview, one that treated trust like a gamble, women like vaults, and desire like a danger best locked away. You ease further into the hush of ancient corridors and candlelit corners, and tonight you're not with kings or knights or wandering monks. You're standing quietly beside a very ordinary man, maybe a merchant, a shoemaker, or a second son of a noble family, with just enough coin to marry, but not enough to make headlines. He's married now. His bride is lovely, pale as parchment, and barely 16, and he is terrified. Not because she's scandalous or wild. Quite the opposite. She's devout, too devout, prays more than she speaks, keeps her eyes down, flinches at the mere suggestion of touch, and he's beginning to realize he didn't marry a woman, he married a holy relic. Welcome to the other side of purity panic. Holy wives versus human wives. You've already seen how virginity was praised, demanded, commodified. But for many men in the Middle Ages, marrying a virgin wasn't just desirable. It was the equivalent of marrying the Virgin Mary herself. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's how deeply religious symbolism bled into marriage. The Church taught that a woman's body, untouched and chaste, was a mirror of divine perfection. The closer she was to Mary's example, the better. And that meant a lot of brides came into marriage already coated in layers of sanctity, layers that were impossible to peel off without guilt. Imagine what that does to a relationship. You lie beside your new wife and reach for her gently, but she's spent years hearing that touch is sinful, that desire is dirty, that holy women resist temptation. She's not faking coldness, she's surviving spiritual conditioning. And you're beginning to question whether you've just defiled something sacred. This confusion wasn't uncommon. In fact, medieval clerics frequently warned men that the act of consummation could corrupt the soul, unless done with prayer and restraint. A husband was encouraged to guide his wife gently toward her duty, but not to enjoy it too much. That would be lust. And lust, even in marriage, was dangerous. Let's make this clear. Even lawful sex, if done with too much enthusiasm, was considered sinful. One theologian wrote that spouses should only lie together in moderation, with sorrow for the act. Another advised that couples should pray before and after intercourse, asking forgiveness for their base urges. Romance? Not exactly candlelit dinners and poetry. Now here's the twist. While men were told to lead, women were expected to resist, at least a little. Purity wasn't just physical, it was behavioral. A truly holy wife was modest, hesitant, and slow to awaken to desire. This led to a bizarre marital dynamic. Men were taught to coax, women were taught to retreat, and the result? Mutual guilt, constant hesitation. You walk now through a small parish church where stained glass depicts Saint Cecilia, hands clasped, eyes skyward, rejecting the touch of a would-be husband. The lesson is clear. The holiest women are those who say no, even after marriage. Some saints, like Saint Margaret, were praised for defying their husbands. Others were canonized because they died before ever having to consummate a marriage. In this way, the Church presented chastity not as a phase of life, but as the ideal state of womanhood. So what happens when a flesh-and-blood woman enters a marriage with that expectation hanging over her? Let's pause for a haunting tidbit. There were husbands who, rather than consummate the marriage, entered spiritual agreements with their wives to remain celibate companions. These were known as Josephite marriages, named for Joseph, husband of Mary, who famously never knew his wife. Some of these arrangements were voluntary. Others were initiated by guilt-ridden husbands who didn't want to tarnish their wife's holiness. You imagine the wedding night. Two people sitting in silence, side by side, hands barely touching, the pressure of heaven pressing down through the rafters, each of them wondering if sleeping together will doom their souls or their marriage. This tension bled into how women viewed themselves as well. Many brides, even years into marriage, believed that enjoying sex was sinful. Confessionals were filled with women sobbing over their inability to remain indifferent to their husbands. Arousal, that was for sinners. Passion for harlots. Good wives were silent, still, unmoved. Historians still argue how widespread this level of suppression was. In urban centers, especially during the later Middle Ages, attitudes began to soften. But in rural villages and devout communities, this model held strong. And it's not just theology, it was literature too. You flip through the pages of medieval romances, and you'll find a pattern. The ideal woman is chaste, aloof, and often described in religious terms. Her skin is pale as chapel wax, her voice like sacred bells. She is adored from a distance, and if she ever reciprocates desire, her purity is tainted, her character suspect. This led to a deep emotional dilemma for many husbands. They were told to desire their wives, but also to revere them, to lead them into sex, but also to not want it too much, to guide their wives spiritually while suppressing their own pleasure. Some managed to balance this tightrope, many did not. Let's drop in on a record from a 13th century monastery, where a man confesses to a priest that he cannot lay with his wife without weeping. He says he feels like he's violating something sacred each time. He's not alone. Other records describe men who sought penance after every act of intimacy, even within marriage. And women? They often confess the opposite, not guilt over being touched, but shame for not enjoying it. One confessor wrote that a woman wept bitterly because her body responded even when her soul recoiled. She wasn't sinning, she was human. But no one had ever told her those two things could coexist. Here's a peculiar historical tidbit. In some convents, young girls were taught how to suppress their natural reactions to affection. They were told to clench their teeth during hugs, avoid eye contact with boys, and sleep with their hands over their stomachs to keep the devil from entering through dreams. So when these same girls became wives, is it any wonder that intimacy felt wrong? And yet, not all were passive. Some women eventually rejected the idea of being holy wives and embraced their role as partners, lovers, and even, in rare cases, initiators. Letters survive from women writing boldly to their husbands, asking them to return home soon, to remember their kisses, to bring wine to the bedchamber. But those letters were rarely preserved publicly. They weren't the model. The model still was Mary, untouched, unchanging, unreachable. You lie still now, listening to the silence of stone churches and whispered prayers. You see the outline of two newlyweds in a candlelit room, unsure how to touch each other without breaking the spell of virtue. And you realize, in the Middle Ages, marrying a virgin wasn't just about honor. It was about iconography, about living with a woman who had been sculpted into something divine, and then trying to turn that sculpture into a human partner. It wasn't easy, it wasn't romantic, and it often left both people feeling like failures. So maybe the fear wasn't that a virgin wife would sin, maybe it was that she never would. And the man, desperate for affection and companionship, would spend his life worshiping someone who never quite stepped off the altar. You turn over gently now, lulled by whispers of sanctity and suspicion, and settle beside the flickering outlines of medieval minds trying to understand love, desire, and dread all at once. But tonight, the fear doesn't come from churches or courts. It seeps in from parchment, poetry, and the strange, humming heart of imagination. Because now you're entering the world of philosophers, priests, and poets. Welcome to the realm where virginity wasn't just a moral value, It was a cosmic enigma, and to many medieval men, a virgin wife wasn't just pure, she was dangerously unknowable. You've heard the warnings by now. Purity was sacred, volatile, powerful. But in the writings of monks, mystics, and amateur love theorists, virgins were painted as something far more complicated. They were figures of temptation and salvation, simultaneously desirable and terrifying. One philosopher likened virginity to fire, warm from a distance, deadly up close. You wander through a dim scriptorium where monks copy pages by candlelight. One text speaks of Eve as the fallen woman, seduced, seductive, the origin of sin. Another lifts up Mary, the second Eve, as the ultimate virgin, unstained and untouched. These two images, Eve and Mary, became the framework for how men viewed all women, either dangerous or divine. There was no middle, so if you married a virgin, which did you get? That's the dilemma. On one hand, she was the epitome of moral perfection, soft, quiet, obedient. On the other, she was a symbol of raw, unstable energy, something you didn't quite understand, something you couldn't control. Men were drawn to it and repelled by it at the same time, and that's where things got really weird. Let's dive into a fringe but fascinating belief. Some medieval thinkers claimed that virgins had the power to heal, not through medicine or herbs, but just by touch. A virgin's hand placed over a wound, her breath near a fevered brow. In some miracle stories, simply walking past a sick person was enough to spark recovery. So what happens when that kind of woman becomes your wife? Well, now you're sleeping next to a figure half angel, half mystic. You're expected to lead her, teach her, protect her, but what if she has powers you don't understand? What if she isn't just a girl in a white dress, but a kind of divine battery you accidentally married? Historians still argue whether these ideas stemmed from actual belief or were more literary embellishment. But they show up everywhere, from religious tracts to love poetry. In one 13th century poem, the narrator calls his beloved a light that blinds, a rose that bleeds, a storm in velvet. Romantic, sure, but also terrifying, because even in admiration you hear the fear. What is she capable of? Let's take a strange detour into medieval medicine again. Some believed that intercourse with a virgin could cure leprosy. Yes, leprosy, the great plague of the medieval world. The logic went like this. Leprosy was a disease of decay. Virginity was purity, untouched by the world. Therefore, coupling the two created cosmic balance. So in some dark corners of history, sick men sought out virgin brides, not for love or legacy, but for healing. Did it work? Of course not. But belief is a powerful thing, and fear even more so. You lean in closer now, peering at a parchment covered in dense Latin. A scholar writes that virgins are unknowable to men, for they are closer to heaven than to earth. That might sound poetic, but it also planted a seed. Maybe these women weren't just unfamiliar, they were unnatural. That made them dangerous. In love treatises, yes, those existed. Women who hadn't been awakened by a man were described as cold, wild, or spiritually locked. And the man's role? To unlock her, carefully, or risk spiritual fallout. That's where the fear began. If you misstep, you might not just fail to please her, you might break her entirely. There's a chilling undercurrent here, the idea that a virgin wasn't just pure, but incomplete. That a woman had to be shaped by a man to become real. And that transformation, like all transformations, came with risk. Let's slow it down for a second with a curious fact. Some men wore talismans on their wedding night, small religious charms or tokens, to protect them from being overcome by a virgin's spiritual intensity. One record from Burgundy mentions a groom who carried a scrap of a saint's cloak beneath his shirt, because he feared being weakened in the loins by maiden's power. Translation, he was afraid she'd ruin him, not through malice but through purity. And this wasn't just about sex, it was about authority. A wife who had never known another man was expected to look to her husband for guidance in all things, social, spiritual, even emotional. But what if she didn't? What if she questioned him? What if her innocence gave way to independence? You find records of men who became jealous not of other suitors, but of their wives' prayers, of their devotion to saints, of their long hours in chapel. One nobleman wrote bitterly that his bride clings more to her crucifix than to my name. He felt eclipsed, not by a rival, but by her spiritual autonomy. That's the paradox. Virginity made women ideal wives, but also impossible ones. And so men wrote about it, talked about it, built entire emotional architectures to process their unease. Poets called virgin women mirrors of light that couldn't be touched. Priests warned that excessive desire, even within marriage, could wither the soul. Doctors, lacking anything close to science, said that too much contact with virgin energy could cause a man to become dull of wit or weak of breath. And always, there was the question no one said aloud: what happens if I don't awaken her? What happens if I fail? Let's dip into a particularly odd story, one from the margins of a medieval book of miracles. A man claimed that his virgin wife never spoke after their wedding, not a word. She prayed, ate, slept, obeyed, but never addressed him. After weeks of silence, he took her to a priest. She confessed that she had taken a secret vow of silence in honor of Saint Catherine. The husband filed for annulment, stating he had married a statue. Again, the line between woman and relic blurred. By now, your body's softening into stillness, but your thoughts are dancing somewhere between scripture and superstition. You realize that fear of virgin wives wasn't always about what they might do, but about what they represented: mystery, purity, danger, and a kind of power that men couldn't quite name. Because sometimes, what you think you want, what society tells you to cherish, turns out to be more complicated, more unpredictable, more human, and in a world that feared unpredictability above all else, that made virgin wives not just idealized, but feared. Your breath slows now, wrapped in the hum of forgotten verses and cloistered fears. You're walking softer, deeper into the maze of medieval hearts, not just the ones behind stone walls and candlelit altars, but the ones that beat behind silk sleeves and lute strings. Because now you're not in the courtroom or the church. You're in a poem. Welcome to the age of troubadours and sonnets, the age of idealized love, secret glances, and the maddening fantasy of the untouched. You've arrived in the world of courtly love and the virgin trap. At first it sounds lovely. A knight pledging himself to a noble lady. He writes her songs. He sighs beneath her window. He goes to war carrying a ribbon from her gown. He promises to serve her, adore her, worship her, always from afar. But here's where things get twisted. That love wasn't meant to be fulfilled. In fact, it wasn't even supposed to be returned. The perfect object of affection, a virgin, untouchable, remote, holy. You pause beneath the balcony of a fictional castle as a troubadour recites his latest lament. She is my sun, my prayer, my agony. I cannot touch her, for she is too pure. He clutches his lute like a holy relic, not an instrument. Because his lady isn't a person, she's a symbol. Courtly love wasn't about relationships, it was about yearning. The more unattainable the woman, the greater the man's devotion. And that meant virgins, especially noble ones, became objects of obsessive fantasy, desired not for who they were, but for what they represented: mystery, morality, and above all, restraint. And you guessed it, this fantasy wreaked havoc on real marriages. Imagine being a young wife, newly married to a man who once wrote sonnets to a noble woman he could never have. Now you're expected to match her purity, her piety, her perfection, while also bearing children, managing the household, and maintaining your reputation. How exactly do you compete with an imaginary virgin? You can't, and many women didn't try. Let's wander into a parlor in 12th century Aquitaine, where Eleanor herself, yes, that Eleanor, hosts a group of poets and philosophers. They debate love, They declare that a man cannot truly love a woman once she's his wife, because love, in their world, requires suffering. And once a woman is won, she's no longer sacred. She becomes ordinary, tainted by reality. You see the problem, don't you? This dynamic, idealizing women as long as they're unavailable, meant that real wives, even virginal ones, quickly lost their glow. Some men mourned this change. Others blamed their wives for falling from grace. Still others returned to the fantasy, writing poems about new, untouchable maidens, while their flesh and blood partners raised children alone. And what about the women? Many played along, some out of necessity, others out of genuine belief. They learned to mirror the qualities praised in poems: modesty, silence, a kind of spiritual aloofness. Some even performed virginity within marriage, remaining emotionally distant, sexually passive, and socially reserved. Historians still argue whether this performance was strategic or internalized. Maybe it was both, but the consequences were real. The more men worshipped fantasy, the less they engaged with reality, and the more they clung to ideal virgins, the more they feared the moment when fantasy had to become fact. Let's pause here for one of those niche, delightful bits of medieval oddity. In some regions, a man could declare a public vow of courtoisie, a pledge to serve a lady without ever touching her. If he succeeded, he was praised. If he failed, he was mocked as too eager, too earthy. One poem even ends with a line that translates to, "He touched her hand, and so she fell. No longer a dream, but merely a girl." Ouch. This anxiety bled into marriage law too. Some courts were lenient toward men who refused to consummate a marriage on the grounds that the woman lacked mystery. That's right. A real, breathing wife could be rejected because she didn't match the romantic image built in her husband's head. She spoke too much. She smiled at the wrong time. She had opinions. She wasn't the Virgin Mary crossed with a statue. It didn't help that preachers often borrowed language from courtly love to describe piety. The church painted spiritual perfection as a kind of emotional virginity, a heart reserved only for God. Women who embraced this model became less accessible to their husbands, and in turn, more desirable in theory, less so in practice. You might wonder, where did this obsession come from? Part of it was the rise of Mariolatry, the intense medieval reverence for the Virgin Mary. As her cult spread, so did the qualities associated with her: modesty, silence, obedience, and above all, untouchedness. Add to that a booming literary culture that prized emotional agony and unfulfilled longing, and suddenly, desire became incompatible with intimacy. Here's a strange little tale from Provence. A young poet was set to marry a merchant's daughter. Before the wedding, he wrote 36 poems about her beauty and grace. But on their wedding night, he wept, not from joy, but from grief. She had smiled at him, spoken too familiarly, called him by his name. She stepped out of the dream, he later wrote, and into my room, and I was afraid. And this wasn't just a quirk of insecure men. Some women embraced the role of the unreachable. It gave them power, safety, influence. In some noble courts, women held salons, intellectual gatherings, where they remained above courtship, controlling conversation without engaging in desire. They were admired, protected, even exalted. Until, of course, they married and were expected to shed the aura, step off the pedestal, and perform. That fall from fantasy to function, it broke many of them. One noblewoman in a 14th century German diary wrote, "I was their moon until I became their meal. They sang for me, then fed from me." She wasn't bitter, she was exhausted. Because being a fantasy isn't freedom, it's a trap. And now, as you turn your head on the pillow, you realize the fear of virgin wives wasn't always about their bodies. Sometimes it was about the role men forced them into. Perfect, unknowable, and ultimately unsustainable. A fantasy is lovely, until it becomes a responsibility. And no woman, however pure, could live up to the version of herself imagined by poets, priests, and scared husbands with too many books and not enough wisdom. So the tragedy played out again and again. Love that wilted on contact, devotion that turned to fear, and women caught between pedestal and pillow, between legend and life. Because in the Middle Ages, to be loved was often to be idealized, and to be idealized was to be feared. You stir slightly, the comfort of your bed folding around you like velvet. But across the centuries, the sheets were often less soft, scrutinized, stained, and on rare nights, suspiciously spotless, because now you're witnessing the moment when everything unravels. When a groom wakes up, looks at his new wife, and realizes she wasn't a virgin. Whether it's true or not doesn't even matter, because in the medieval world, when the virgin wasn't one, was the ultimate betrayal, and sometimes a fatal one. You stand now in the quiet aftermath of a medieval wedding night. The fire has burned down to embers, the guests are asleep, the room smells of wax, sweat, and anxiety, and the husband, who expected blood, pain, or at the very least resistance, got none of it. No visible proof, no dramatic moment, just awkward silence and a creeping realization. The next move could ruin lives. Let's be clear, not all women bled on their wedding night. We know this. Modern science knows this. But the medieval world didn't. To them, the lack of blood meant one thing: she'd been with someone before, and if she had, the consequences came crashing down like a cathedral ceiling. In noble houses, this wasn't just a romantic disappointment, it was a political emergency. If the bride was spoiled, the marriage could be annulled, the dowry returned, her family disgraced. Worse still, she could be accused of fraud, a charge with real legal weight. Let's pause on one of those cold, strange truths. In parts of 13th century France and England, a man who discovered that his bride was not a virgin could file a lawsuit under breach of contract. The bride's body was the product. Virginity was the guarantee. If that guarantee didn't hold up under inspection, it was grounds for legal action. Imagine that courtroom. The husband takes the stand and describes the night. The priest takes notes. The father-in-law looks pale. The bride is silent because her body is on trial, not her words. Some families tried to preempt this disaster. They hired midwives to inspect the bride before the wedding and write letters of affirmation. In some cases, a bishop might be paid to endorse her spiritual purity, even if physical evidence was lacking. And if things still went wrong, out came the bribes, the excuses, the desperate inventions. Let's step into one of those awkward family meetings. The morning after a bloodless wedding, a nobleman claims the union is invalid. The bride's mother insists that her daughter is simply one of those women, the kind whose hymen vanished in childhood, perhaps from riding horses, or dancing, or a fall in the orchard. These excuses were repeated so often that they became cliché, and yet, sometimes they worked, because here's the thing, virginity wasn't really about anatomy, it was about belief. If enough people could be convinced, or paid, to uphold the illusion, then everything could proceed as planned. But when that illusion shattered completely, the punishment could be brutal. In one notorious case in Italy, a young bride was accused of deceiving her husband. He claimed she'd offered no resistance and failed to produce blood. The court ruled against her. She was publicly whipped and sent to a convent for the rest of her life. No one ever asked if maybe she just didn't bleed, or if she'd been assaulted, or if the husband was lying. And yes, that happened too. Let's talk about the darker angle. Some husbands lied. Why? Maybe to get out of the marriage, maybe to keep the dowry but ditch the bride, maybe to humiliate her family in a power play. Accusing a wife of not being a virgin became a tool, weaponized purity. One nobleman in Burgundy married a young woman, enjoyed the wedding feast, and then claimed she wasn't a virgin the next morning. The court sided with him because he was wealthy, persuasive, and well-connected. She was returned to her parents dishonored, even though later letters suggest the accusation was false. It wasn't just nobles either. Among commoners, gossip moved faster than any court case. If a woman was rumored to have been with someone else, true or not, her value plummeted. She might be rejected at the altar, or worse, married, then abandoned. Here's a disturbing little fringe fact. In some towns, men were known to test their brides during courtship. That is, pressure them into premarital encounters and then use the results to judge their worthiness. If she said no, she was considered suspiciously proud. If she said yes, she was ruined. A no-win situation if there ever was one. And while men were out there boasting about mistresses and brothel escapades, women were being crushed by silence. Because even if she was a virgin, if the signs didn't show, she had no way to prove it. Her body couldn't speak, but her reputation screamed. There's one particular case, recorded in a dusty 14th century Parisian court ledger, where a bride slit her thigh with a knife the morning after her wedding, then smeared the sheet in blood. Why? Because she had heard the whisperings. She knew her husband was suspicious, and she didn't want to risk exile, or worse. When the trick was discovered, she wasn't punished. In fact, the husband stayed with her. They had children. But the story lived on in whispers. A cautionary tale not about deception, but about desperation. Let's take a moment to recognize a sliver of resistance. Some women fought back. A few brave brides, when accused of false purity, stood their ground. One famously declared, "You want proof of blood? Then cut your own skin and call yourself a virgin." She was dragged out of the court in chains. But her words, scratched into the margin of the trial record, endured. Because not all men feared unvirgins. Some feared themselves, feared the shame of impotence, the insecurity of inexperience, the overwhelming weight of expectations they couldn't meet. And in those cases, it was easier to shift the blame, to point a finger at the bride and say, "She failed." The truth is, the non-virgin wife became a scapegoat for everything men couldn't understand or control. She was feared not because she was impure, but because she knew something he didn't, had lived, had been touched, had felt. And that scared him, because what if she compared him to someone else? What if she wasn't afraid? What if her silence wasn't submission, but judgment? You let your breath ease now, the soft weight of medieval guilt passing through you like mist through a window. You imagine the women who stood before husbands, before courts, before rumors, their bodies judged without mercy, and the men, sweating behind pride and paranoia, too scared to love someone real. Because when the virgin wasn't one, everything cracked, the illusion, the myth, the power dynamic, and in its place, a human being with a past, a story, a voice, and that, for many men in the Middle Ages, was the most terrifying thing of all. The fire is lower now, flickering with the last breath of embers. The worst of the wedding night drama may have passed, but you're not quite free of it yet. Tonight, you're peeking through the thin wooden lattice of a church confessional, where secrets are whispered in Latin, behind closed veils, with souls on the line. Because now you're entering a space where fear, guilt, and performance collide. Welcome to the confession booth drama, where virginity, once lost or questioned, became both a sin and a strategy. In theory, confession was a sanctuary, a place to lay down your burdens, a quiet moment with a priest, God, and your conscience. But in practice, especially in the medieval world, it could feel more like an interrogation, especially for women. You step into a shadowed chapel now, where a young wife kneels before a carved wooden screen. Her voice trembles. She's barely audible, and still the priest leans closer. He wants to know everything, not just her sins, but the nature of her thoughts, her dreams, her desires. He asks whether she was pure before marriage, if she enjoyed her husband's touch, if she thinks of other men, and whether she regrets what has passed. This wasn't invasive by accident, it was institutionalized. Confession manuals from the 13th and 14th centuries included detailed questionnaires, especially for female penitents. Priests were instructed to press for specifics, especially around sexual purity, because knowing the truth wasn't enough. They wanted it in detail. Why? Some believe precision revealed sincerity. Others, let's be honest, were just curious. The church was, after all, made of men. Let's pause for a chilling little historical nugget. The Dominican order, tasked with rooting out heresy, also helped shape confession into a spiritual audit. One guidebook for confessors advised asking married women how often they lie with their husband and whether they experience pleasure therein. Not exactly your average Sunday chat. So what happened when a woman admitted she hadn't been a virgin on her wedding night? Technically, she'd already committed the sin, but confession allowed for absolution, if she showed proper remorse. And if not, the consequences ranged from extended penance to full-blown excommunication. But it wasn't just about sin, it was about narrative control. Many women learned quickly how to confess strategically, say just enough to show humility, but not enough to prompt scandal. Some confessed impure thoughts instead of actions. Others wept over their failure to please their husbands, subtly framing their guilt in ways that elevated their virtue, and still others said nothing at all. Silence, after all, was sometimes the safest prayer. You wander now into a monastery scriptorium where a priest records anonymous confessions. One entry reads, "A woman confesses that she did not bleed on her wedding night. Her husband questions her purity. She says it is a punishment from God for her pride. She internalizes the failure, owns it, spiritualizes it, but never challenges the lie." Historians still debate how sincere these confessions were. Were they honest, strategic, coerced? Probably all three, because when the stakes were this high, when virginity defined your place in society, confession became a performance, a test, a gamble. But here's the twist. The church itself was often guilty of hypocrisy. While priests interrogated women about their pasts, their own behaviors didn't always hold up. Numerous records describe clergymen, especially lower-ranking ones, engaging in affairs with parishioners. Some even fathered children. Yet they stood behind the screen, demanding accountability from women who had far less power. Let's pull back the veil for a real case. In 1362, a priest in southern France was accused of coercing young brides during confession, asking increasingly personal questions, then offering absolution in exchange for sexual favors. When discovered, he was quietly moved to another parish. No trial, no penance. The women, silenced. And yet, many priests were sincere. They truly believed they were saving souls, guiding the lost, protecting the sanctity of marriage. Some even defended women, advising husbands to be gentle, forgiving, even patient when their brides did not perform as expected. In those rare moments, the confessional became a lifeline. Still, the drama lingered. You crouch beside a confessional in Venice, where a woman confesses, between sobs, that she lied to her husband. She wasn't a virgin, she never told him, but she loves him now. The priest, torn between dogma and mercy, tells her to do penance and be a better wife. No further action is taken, but the fear never leaves her. She returns week after week, unsure if she's still married in the eyes of God, or her husband. Here's a little-known side effect of confession culture. It trained women to narrate their own shame, even if they had nothing to confess. The habit of framing every thought, every touch, every deviation from the pure wife ideal as sin seeped into daily life, into marriage, into motherhood, into memory. Let's detour into something strange. In one Benedictine convent, nuns were taught to confess dreams of men they had never met, a training exercise in humility. One record even shows a woman confessing that she felt joy in her wedding night, and feared that pleasure was a sin. Her priest told her to pray for sorrow, not for wrongdoing, but for feeling good. Yes, that's real. And it wasn't just about brides. Widows, too, were pulled into this cycle. A widow who remarried might be questioned about whether she still dreamed of her first husband, if she preferred him in bed, if her second marriage was less chaste. Even in death, a woman's body was never hers. You begin to see it now, don't you? The confessional wasn't a sanctuary. It was a stage, a place where women learned how to edit their lives into something acceptable, where they absorbed the idea that silence equaled sanctity, that guilt was proof of virtue, and this trained them to navigate not just faith, but fear. Some women weaponized it. In one sharp twist, a bride accused of impurity turned the tables, confessing not her own sins, but her husband's. She claimed he visited a brothel the week before their wedding. The priest, caught off guard, gave her a lighter penance. The husband, publicly shamed, withdrew his accusations. She'd saved herself, not by pretending to be pure, but by proving he wasn't. Rare, bold, almost poetic, but most women didn't fight. They whispered, wept, prayed, confessed, and hoped no one would dig too deep, because they knew the game. The church preached that God forgave everything, but society didn't, and so they carried their stories inside them. Stories of stolen purity, real or imagined, of wedding nights gone wrong, of priests who asked too much, of husbands who believed too little, of lives lived in the liminal space between sin and silence. Now you close your eyes and hear it, the soft murmur behind the confessional screen, the rustle of veils, the echo of questions that have no good answers. You feel the weight of a world where redemption is offered, but never free, and where a woman, no matter how devout, is always asked, "But were you pure?" And that's the haunting refrain of the Middle Ages, in the chapel, in the bedroom, in the booth. Were you pure? The room is dimmer now. The fire's down to a whisper, shadows long and wavering like forgotten thoughts. And just when you think you've reached the strangest corners of medieval purity panic, the air sharpens. You're not in a wedding chamber anymore. You're in the woods. The stakes are no longer marital, they're mortal, because now you've arrived at the era when fear of virgin wives morphed into something even darker. Witch hunts, virgin tests, and moral panic. You thought a missing bloodstain was terrifying? Try being accused of sorcery for being too silent, too seductive, too strange. Because virginity, once prized as holy, could suddenly be recast as unnatural. And unnatural women? They burned. Let's step into a grim little paradox. Many women were accused of witchcraft because they were too chaste. Think about that. Virginity, the golden badge of morality, could become suspicious when it lingered too long. A woman who didn't marry? Suspicious? One who didn't show interest in men? A problem? One who avoided childbirth, pleasure, or even company? Dangerous. The logic was twisted. If a woman wasn't married, who protected her? If she wasn't touched, who owned her? And if she didn't seem to need anyone, well, what was she? In the late medieval period, especially during times of plague, famine, or social unrest, people turned to scapegoats. And unmarried, sexually ambiguous women were perfect targets. They were seen as suspicious, powerful, unregulated by men, and worst of all, unreadable. You walk now through a foggy alpine village, where a midwife named Katrina is accused of cursing a newborn. Her crime? She never married, claimed she had visions, grew herbs, kept to herself. Oh, and once, years ago, she was said to have refused a marriage proposal because she wanted to remain clean. It's enough. She's dragged to trial. No real evidence, just whispers and the echo of a purity that's been turned inside out. The same silence that once marked her as saintly is now read as sinister. And how do they test her? Here comes the trial by virginity. Yes, that was real. In some parts of Europe, especially in late medieval Germany, Switzerland, and parts of northern Italy, virginity became a way to prove innocence during witchcraft trials. A maiden couldn't be a witch, the thinking went. But she also couldn't be too much of a maiden. So the court might order a physical examination by matrons or, disturbingly, by clerics. If she was found to be unbroken, she was less likely to be burned. But if she wasn't, if her body didn't match their narrow expectations, then she was fair game for the fire. Imagine that. Your life hanging on an inspection, your body stripped of dignity and turned into a ledger of sin or sanctity. And the kicker? No matter what the exam found, the verdict could swing either way. Virgin? She's a witch because she's unnaturally untouched. Not a virgin? She's a witch because she's a fallen woman. It was a trap with no exit. Here's one of those strange little details that historians love and dread. A 1480 trial record from Bavaria describes a woman being declared impure by a panel of older women, not because they found signs of sexual activity, but because her skin was too pale, her voice too calm, her hair too smooth. All supposedly signs of having been with the devil. There's no logic, only fear, and yet virginity still held power. In some corners of this twisted tapestry, the untouched woman was seen not as evil, but as holy, which created a second trap. Being too pure made you mystical, and mystics, unless sanctioned by the church, were also dangerous. You hover near the cell of Marjorie Kemp, a real historical figure, a deeply devout Englishwoman who claimed visions, performed long pilgrimages, and described herself as a bride of Christ. She remained celibate for most of her life, despite being married. She was never charged as a witch, but many considered her suspect. Too loud, too strange, too untouched. So here we are again. The fear wasn't sex, it was power, and virginity, when not absorbed into marriage, became power in its rawest, most unsettling form. Now let's talk about the moral panic. Witch hunts didn't happen in a vacuum. They flared up when people were desperate, after poor harvests, plagues, wars. During times of stress, societies look for simple answers, and women's bodies, especially when wrapped in mystery and misunderstanding, were easy targets. In many of these witch trials, especially between the 1400s and 1600s, sexual purity was directly referenced. One accusation might describe the woman as never touched by man, and another might claim she used her untouched state to commune with spirits. Some texts even claimed that the devil preferred virgins, that their uncorrupted flesh gave him more room to dwell. Sound familiar? It's the same logic used by fearful husbands on wedding night, twisted just a step further. And yet, paradoxically, other sources claimed that witches lost their virginity to the devil, that they had secret, infernal unions in dark forests, under black moons, with no proof except a witch's mark somewhere on their body. So again, purity was either a danger or a lie, no winning, no clarity. Let's detour into an especially surreal tidbit. Some trial records include virgin tests that involved dropping candle wax onto the accused's skin. If she flinched, she was said to be guilty. If she didn't, her heart was already cold. Either result meant conviction. That's how warped things became. And while all this sounds medieval, because it was, the echoes lasted. For centuries, society held onto the double-edged myth of virginity, that it made women powerful and punishable in equal measure, that it needed to be protected and feared. By now, your thoughts are heavy, but your understanding is deepening. You see how the obsession with purity spiraled into paranoia, how one woman's silence became another's sentence, how virginity, far from being a private state, was turned into evidence, weapon, warning, and you wonder, when did it stop? You'll get your answer soon, but not yet, not tonight. Tonight, the wind outside your imagined stone cottage picks up. A bell tolls in a distant tower. Somewhere, a torch sputters. And a woman, innocent in every way that matters, waits to hear her fate from a tribunal of people more afraid of her power than of the truth. Because in this world, virginity was never just about chastity. It was about control. And control, once threatened, always comes with fire. You've made it to the edge now, where the echo of centuries begins to quiet, and the tangled obsession with purity starts to unravel. The fire in the hearth is fading, but you're still warm, surrounded by the soft breath of history finally exhaling. This is where the long, uneasy grip of virginity, so feared, so fetishized, begins to loosen, because now we drift gently into the slow, uneven process of letting go. Let's be clear, it didn't happen all at once. Virginity didn't vanish from the stage of human panic in a single year, or even a single century. But like a thread pulled slowly from a tightly woven tapestry, the hold it had over marriage, morality, and identity began to fray. And in that unraveling, something tender, something true, started to take shape. You walk now through the streets of 17th century London, where the first murmurs of medical common sense begin to echo. Early anatomists, still misguided in many ways, start to question the idea that bleeding proves anything. They dissect, they diagram, they observe. And while their motives aren't always noble, their findings matter. One English midwife, writing in 1681, notes bluntly, "Many women are born without this mark men search for, and many who possess it are no more virtuous than the wind." Quiet, bold, true. It would take centuries more for this kind of thinking to move beyond the fringe, but the wheels are turning. Enlightenment thinkers challenge dogma. Writers question inherited myths, and the world, ever so slightly, begins to think less about blood on sheets and more about consent. Still, the obsession doesn't disappear. Victorian culture, for instance, clings to it with laced-up intensity, but now it's cloaked in romance instead of religion. Virginity becomes the image of fragile femininity, ready to be saved, not sanctified. Literature is flooded with pale heroines, whose untouched status is less a symbol of holiness and more a tool of plot development. But even that begins to shift. By the 20th century, with the rise of modern psychology, early feminism, and access to education, more women begin questioning the idea that their worth is tied to their sexual history. Virginity, once a cage, starts to look more like a choice. And choice, that's a new kind of power. It's not a straight line. There are setbacks, pushbacks, whole generations where the old ideas creep back in, wearing new disguises, but each time, they lose just a little more strength. And somewhere along the way, the fear of virgin wives, once so loud it echoed from castles to cottages, fades into something quieter, not gone, but dulled, replaced slowly, with the idea that people are more than symbols, that love can bloom in truth, not just tradition. You sit now beside a young woman in 1905, penning a letter to her fiancé. She writes, "I am not what they say I should be, but I am kind, and I am brave, and I will love you as well as any saint." She signs it, folds it, sends it, and the sky does not fall. Fast forward another 100 years, and the conversation has changed entirely. Virginity is no longer a legal issue, nor a medical test, nor a moral panic. It's debated, yes, endlessly debated, but now in voices that include women, not just as subjects of law, but as speakers of truth. There's still judgment in some corners, still pressure, but there's also humor, openness, language for nuance, and more importantly, compassion. Because somewhere, somehow, the world figured out what the medieval mind never could, that worth cannot be proven in a bed, that virtue cannot be seen in a drop of blood, that the most dangerous thing about virginity wasn't its presence or absence, but the meaning we attach to it. And so you rest now, knowing that the fear medieval men carried, the fear of being deceived or dishonored or overwhelmed by the mystery of purity, has slowly dissolved into something softer, not gone but different, and with that we slow our pace. The fire has gone to embers now. The wind outside is nothing but a hush against old stone, and your breath, steady, slow, matches the rhythm of centuries easing into sleep. You've wandered far tonight, from shadowed chapels to royal chambers, from whispered confessions to the silent terror of a wedding night. You've traced the arc of a fear older than memory, and watched it slowly dim. What began as obsession became tradition, then paranoia, then performance. But at every step, you saw the truth hiding just beneath the surface. That fear, at its core, was never really about purity. It was about not knowing, about wanting control where none could be had. And yet, despite the trials, the rituals, the silence, you saw sparks of resistance, women who rewrote their roles, men who questioned the rules, moments where love slipped past the dogma, quiet and real. So now, as the final echoes fade, you let your own fear go, not just of history but of judgment, of perfection, of the need to fit someone else's shape. You are not a story written by others. You are not a sheet to be inspected or a vow to be tested. You are human, complicated, whole, and the ghosts of old expectations? Let them go. Let them drift into the corners of forgotten castles and crumbling confessional booths. You, dear listener, have walked through centuries of noise and come out softer, wiser, still. Now breathe. Let it all fade. There are no trials here, no questions, no need to prove anything. Just sleep. You've earned it.